Hi everyone, Professor Henry here with some feedback and a brief lecture on developing research questions. This video will help you see a few helpful ways that you should think about revising your research questions, not just for our course, but for any future research projects you do. We'll look at 3 early stage research questions along with my suggestions and rationale for revision. So our first example question is, does limiting access to guns reduce gun violence? So here we're asking a valid and important question, but the semantic answer to this question would be a simple yes or no. There's also implicit bias in the question, because the question already establishes a relationship between limiting access and reduced violence. Here's another version of the question that avoids yes or no answers and removes the implicit bias. In what ways does limiting access to guns affect gun violence? This question invites a more nuanced debate about gun legislation and violence. Although the research question is more neutral, this isn't to say that you can't eventually support a position on the issue, but that's what you want to do in your thesis statement after your research has informed your stance. Example number 2. Is obesity the product of a cultural norm in America? Here's another question engaging an important issue. But again, it begins with a version of the verb to be, and can be answered with a yes or no. Of course, that yes or no would need to be supported by evidence, yes because or no because. But I think we're limited by seeking sources to simply confirm a yes or no. A version of this question that invites more critical thinking might be something like this. How does the rise of certain cultural norms correlate to the rise of obesity in the United States? This version of the question infers a relationship between cultural norms and obesity, but more interestingly asks how that relationship works. And a bonus version of the question, how does the rise of certain cultural norms among Generation Z affect the rise of obesity? This version is even more specific because it targets a specific population of people, namely Generation Z. And at the time of this video, Generation Z represents the audience who's most likely to read this student's paper, so there's a rhetorical element to the focus of the question as well. It's always a good idea to keep your audience in mind when forming your research question and working thesis. Example number 3. What are the effects of COVID-19 on agriculture? Again, another interesting and important issue, but the phrasing of the question invites a list-type response. What are the effects? Well, there's X, Y, and Z. This kind of question limits us to merely reporting information, rather than constructing an argument on a debatable issue. A version of the question that invites debate might go something like this. How, in the context of COVID-19, must the federal and local governments support the ag industry? This version of the question already implies that the ag industry has been affected by COVID-19, but it also invites us to enter a debate on claims of policy. In other words, it asks, what should we do? This provides greater value to both the researcher and the readers. Okay. So here are a few general takeaways I'd like you to think about as you continue to revise and refine your research questions and eventually your working thesis. Avoid asking questions that lead with terms like is or does, because they invite simple yes or no answers. Instead, try to frame your question with leading words like how or why. Does your research question lead to a yes or no answer? If so, think of ways that you can enter into a debate on an issue, leading with a how, why, or maybe even a should. Unless you're working with a scientific hypothesis, try to avoid a confirmation-seeking bias in your research question, like, does X have Y outcome? Because confirmation bias can contaminate the rest of your research process. Confirmation bias can also put off readers who don't already agree with the bias you're attempting to confirm, so you risk losing the audience you're primarily trying to reach. Avoid asking questions that invite a list-type response, like, what are the effects of? Instead, assume that there are effects. Does your research question invite a list-type response? Do you feel like you're just reporting information? Then ask a question about the nature of those effects or how those effects have an impact on something else that you see as related. That's a lot more interesting and productive than just listing effects. Finally, focus your question on a more narrow subset. For example, not culture, but maybe Central California Asian Americans. This will help you manage the scope of your project so that you're not tackling a demographic that would take a book to cover. I think we'd be hard-pressed to write about society with any depth in 6 pages. But in 6 pages, we can write about how the cultural norms of Generation Z correlate to increasing cases of obesity in the United States. Alrighty, my friends and young scholars, I hope this video has been helpful for you. Remember that all worthwhile research starts from a process of inquiry, so be sure you spend plenty of time thinking about and crafting a good research question. That's the foundation for finding relevant sources, for forming your working thesis, and for drafting your body paragraphs, all of which is the foundation for a great research-driven essay.